Greetings. Straight ahead. I was first, hello, Sarah. I was first telling Monica, I sent her a note the other day, and I was just thinking back. First, I'm always honored to come and talk with you, comrades. And I was saying to her, I was just kind of going back in time when I was just a little bit younger, just a little bit. And I was talking about when I first met Larry Holmes. And this was back after Clifford Glover was killed. And Monica was saying to me, we were dealing with the year on that, I think like 77 or something. And you know, Larry was a little guy. I think he was in elementary school then. But he had come out to support us. And I just thought about how long ago I had a relationship with Workers' World, Youth Against War and Fascism, IAC. Always have felt very comradely and honored to be supported by you. And as we support our need to make revolution, and I was also thinking too, that was the first time back at that day that I met Sam Marcy too. And we actually came to one of the conferences at what hotel was it? Mark Ballroom. Now, you wouldn't know that yet, but that's part of the history that you have to get to be a part of, because you're a continuation of all of this, so you got to absorb all of that. So this evening, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the legacy of our comrade, and I always say our president, our comrade, but also someone who was a dear friend. I was always very honored that President Robert Mugabe always kind of looked at us in the December 12th movement from a historical perspective, that we reminded him of himself at a period in time when they were struggling to build an organization to liberate their country. And so he always looked at us kind of in a fatherly way, in terms of everything has a beginning. And at times, what you have is your vision, you have your commitment, you have your love and respect for the people, and then you have the fight to ideologically become clear on the line of march, which is never simply a straight line, but a line is, one said, one step forward, two steps back, And so first talking about that, because what I wanted to talk to is a little bit about the president, share some experiences with him, and then talk a little bit about the current situation in Zimbabwe, and some of the issues going on in Southern Africa, and then talk a little bit about the sanctions and a historical event taking place on October 25th. But anyway, so in terms of the president, let me always just be very candid. The first time that I had a chance to meet President Robert Mugabe, he was strolling down Malcolm X Boulevard with another comrade, and he came into our bookstore. We had a bookstore called Sunrise Books. It was between 100 and, let me see, it was in 135th Street and 134th Street on 7th Avenue. And he wandered in. He was in the city, and he wandered in, and, the impact of who he was and stuff at that point wasn't really fully clear to me, but he wandered in and talked with us a little bit, and, negotiations and stuff had passed in terms of the liberation of the country, and that was the first time I had a chance to meet him, and the first thing that always hit me was he was always very thoughtful about his surroundings, and always historical in perspective. It seems like he always had a knack of being able to put things in its context, because he always wanted people to understand that you sit at a moment in time and you came from another moment, and hopefully you'll get to this next moment, but it's always to understand where you are. As Dr. John Henry Clark would say, you have to know where you've been, to know where you are, to know where you're going. And so sometimes, he put that in perspective, because he always wanted to say, sometimes things get very difficult, You know, I mean, everybody knows the good times. When things are pushing forward and everything is great, he says, but it's those times that are most difficult that you seat yourself in the moment of history to know you're part of that history and you're not by yourself in that history. And just as you're pushing to make change, people around the world are struggling to make change. And so it kind of puts you in a way to embrace you, particularly in down times. And we know what those are sometimes, you know, when we plan everything and we think it's going to go correct and it doesn't. You know, when the enemy comes out stronger than you thought they would, or you didn't come out as strong as you thought you would, you know. But he always said to put it in context. And so our experiences with him was first getting an understanding of who he was, because who he was has a lot to do with not only his beginnings as a revolutionary, but his leadership in terms of the Zimbabwean revolution. And it kind of gives us some perspective on the end of his life, you know. And for us in the December 12th movement, this year was a year of tremendous losses for us, because our comrade and one of our leadership in the December 12th movement, Comrade Coltrane Chimurenga, passed away this year. And certainly President Mugabe. And in terms of our comrade Chimurenga passing away, the government and the current president, Idi Mnangagwa, granted us something that was, you know, we felt very humbled by. But Coltrane always wanted to be buried in Zimbabwe. And the president said, of course. And so, comrades, we took his body back to Zimbabwe, to not the National Heroes Acre, but every province has a Heroes Acre. And so he was buried in Harare province, in Heroes Acre there, among some of the heroes that came out of that province. And he was given a very high honored burial. He got a 21-gun salute by the Zimbabwean military, and speeches that, yes. You know, something that really humbled us, and speeches from party leadership, and an army chaplain who was just a tremendous person. There's a video that we have, and I'd like to share that with you all so you have a chance to see it, because it's a tremendous honor to us to have that kind of burial. And next year, they bury people differently, and they bury people in Zimbabwe above ground, not underground, and they bury them in cement enclosures, you know. So next year when they put the marble and stuff over it, the permanent one on top, we'll probably go back to see that. But anyway, it was a tremendous loss for us. But it was also an inspiration for us, because our early relationships to Zimbabwe actually came from Comrade Chimurenga. We had a much closer, earlier relationship with Frelimo in Mozambique, and certainly the struggle in the Portuguese colonies in Angola and Guinea-Bissau. And Chimurenga, very early on, there was a comrade named Comrade Kangai who gave Chimurenga his name, and really wanted to recruit him to come back to Zimbabwe to fight in the liberation struggle. And they met at San Francisco College, and but he didn't go. But he always had a warm relationship with the struggle in Zimbabwe, and his relationship to December 12th and him becoming a member of it, and our founding of it. Zimbabwe had always been a very important part of that. So from the very beginning, I remember in 1999, you know, we went to the Party Congress in Zimbabwe. Actually, I took my son along with a delegation, and we had a chance to sit down and talk with President Mugabe the second time when he came in the bookstore. So this is the second time I'm seeing him now from not the bookstore, but in Zimbabwe as the president. And Comrade Musinda, who was the vice president. And he sat down and just talked to us about the nature of their struggle in Zimbabwe. And in that respect, you know, when I talk about this, I'm really kind of talking about President Mugabe, so you get kind of a sense, because you really can't separate the two. And their point to us was simply that underdevelopment is a tremendous, tremendous attack on humanity. It not only in the physical sense of food, clothing, and shelter, but in the psychological and cultural sense of development as a people. To have your development interrupted, sabotaged, and actually trying to underdevelop you and lay that as a basis for the justification to exploit you, not only your resources, but your labor. And so he kind of gave us kind of a backdrop to the struggle in Zimbabwe, the issues that they had to struggle with. First time I had heard about Nahanda, who led the first Shimaranga in Zimbabwe. And this sister, you learn a little more, because, sometimes, when you read revolutionary classical books, they're very da-da-da. But then sometimes you'll read personal reflections that kind of take you a little bit more into what really kind of goes on a little bit. It doesn't take away from that, but it kind of makes it a little more real for you. They really did that? He said that to that guy? He told that woman that kind of stuff. And so I didn't know at the time when they said, Nahanda, she led the first Shimaranga, and they hung her in Salisbury Square, let her body hang there. And, so that was that part of it. But I didn't know till later on that she was a medium, and in culture, she was a spiritual medium and a very powerful cultural figure. And I remember after she passed away, one of the messages she left was, "My bones will return and liberate the country." And that was a powerful message. And President Mugabe, I see it's very interesting about people, President Mugabe was saying it was a message that helped him tap into the masses of people in Zimbabwe. Culture is a tremendous weapon. It can be used against you, or it can be used to liberate yourself. As you know, imperialism wants to destroy it and create a culture that's not yours and give it to you. And it's a culture that dehumanizes you and makes it so individualistic as opposed to collective. And so the president sat down and talked to us about that history of the struggle in Zimbabwe. And one of the important points he made was the struggle for unity and the struggle to build a party. And I think that was one of the things he was saying to us, that you cannot do anything by yourself. That is an impossibility. If you want to make change, if you want to build a house, you can't do it by yourself. The most efficient way, the most social way, the most human way to do things is collectively. And those things that hold up that struggle for collective production and collective access to the wealth that you produce, he says, is a real struggle of humanity, to be the beneficiaries of what belongs to humanity. And so that was my first real, grasp of how deep a thinker the president was. He was definitely an intellectual, many, many degrees, and also spent 11 years in prison, but a tremendous thinker and brilliant thinker. And so when we was talking about unity and that struggle for collectivity and the building of a party, he says there'll be many twists and turns, and sometimes all you'll have with yourself is the belief that you're on the right course. And sometimes you're not sure because people may not reflect agreement with what you see, but you have to have that confidence that you've put the work in, that you put the analysis in, that the commitment is there, and most importantly, the respect for what people say and think and believe, and your fight to convince them of your correctness. And so that was, I think, probably my first tremendous impression from him as a revolutionary. The president was also a Catholic, which has its drawbacks. As drawbacks. But once again, it also demonstrates at critical times in your life, some of the decisions you make, the ideology that they come from, the culture that they come from, has everything to do sometimes in decisions you make. And we all know that ourselves. Sometimes things go beep. I remember I was in Cuba once at what they call them, a rumba. And we were standing there and they were doing a ceremony, and one of the members of the Politburo in the Cuban Communist Party, she was standing next to me. And I was looking at her, and then I noticed she had beads around her wrist, and they were Orisha. beats, and I'm looking at her, looking at what was going on, and I'm saying, whoa, she's really into this, So, that struggle around culture and everything is a beautiful thing. It's an important thing, but life is more than just production. It's also how we relate to each other, the human spirit that we generate with each other. And Mugabe represented that to me. And maybe that's why he was not only the president, he was not only a comrade, but he was also someone who saw an importance. He saw something in us in the December 12th movement that he always held dear to us. In the course of our activities with the president, I can tell you, sometimes I was so humbled by, there would be mass rallies that we were at. And, the security is up and the soldiers around and mass rallies. And, Omowale being one who used to record many of our activities and stuff, I could walk right up to the podium. He's standing here speaking. I'll be right here filming him just like this. And because people view us, this is the December 12th movement. And the December 12th movement are our comrades. And they're comrades of our president, who has taken this deep liking to them, and he sees something in them, and so they just respected us. And it's a country, and we're an organization, but it's a whole country with a people and all that, and they just always deeply respected our commitment for what we believe in and our support for Zimbabwe. And so, once again, the president always expressed the essence to me of the Zimbabweans. I always thought the Zimbabweans kind of most represented, to us, at least in the December 12th movement, the closest ones to a different expression of black culture in this country. It always seems like we just had rhythm with them, And I remember one time, we were going on a farm with a general. I think of his name in a second. His wife was in the car, and she was. It was a driver, and she was in the front seat. And we were driving along the road, and there was a white man standing on the side of the road near one of the farms, and she told the driver to pull over, and she reached in the glove compartment and took out a 9mm and put it in her purse. And she turned around and looked at us and said, "I'll be right back." And she got out of the car and walked over. We had a conversation, because obviously he was somewhere where he shouldn't have been, and we didn't know he was out of place. And she had a conversation, he talked, and she came back in the car, got back in the car, put the gun back in the glove compartment, and said, "Okay, everything's okay." But it was that attitude of response. This is our country now. And no, we're not out of place in our country. You're out of place, because I don't know why you're over there, but I'm going to go find out. And it was also liberating for me because it was his sister, straight cold, never hesitated, went right in the glove compartment to go see what was up, And it was that kind of spirit, It was that kind of spirit that gets honed in the struggle to liberate yourself, old cliches, old habits, old different expressions of oppression get challenged in revolutionary struggle. Men who can cook but can't shoot, cook. Women who can shoot but can't cook, don't cook, they shoot. And those things kind of get resolved very quickly in the fields of battle in that sense. So there are many cultural and stories we have, but the president was always a constant theme through it. Many people say that, and particularly the West and the opposition try to bring up a terrible time in Zimbabwe history when there was actually a civil war. And they always like to talk about the Civil War, that the North Korean trained troops, anytime you're going to be bad, they attach you to something that they've made terrible. They say communist. Oh, he was with that communist. And, Trump is very much into that now. These socialists, America will never be socialist and stuff. But they attach you to something. So the North Koreans are like the devil on earth. So the Zimbabwe troops were not just Zimbabwean troops. They were North Korean trained troops. And that really made them evil. The North Koreans, they don't like us, But he told us once about it was a terrible period. He says, but it was a civil war. And he says, you have to put everything in context. Brother killing brother, sister killing sister, struggles among the people can be horrific things, He says, but it was a civil war. And it's always portrayed as genocide. It's portrayed as this evil thing to kill people. He said that's not what it was. It was a struggle out of a political line and the necessity for Zimbabwe to be united. And he said, so there was a civil war. But I could always tell he was troubled by it. Not by how they portrayed it, but that it happened in their history. But he wanted us to understand the context. Everything is in context. And his thing is also, don't always just go by what I'm telling you. He said, go research for yourself. Our history is there in our libraries. Our history is among our people. So those issues or questions that you have, talk to the people. Let them talk to you. I remember this sister one time, we were out near Mudzi, which is near the Mozambican border, and we were talking to these brothers and sisters, and this sister was telling us about her role in the revolution. And I think this is what Mugabe was saying. Talk to the people and see what made them make revolution. What generated that commitment and selflessness to possibly give up their life to free their country. And she was saying that her role was what they call them the boys, the guerrillas. When the boys came in, our role in the village was to take care of them. Make sure they had a safe place to sleep, make sure they ate and stuff. But everybody had this different role. And I saw in her eyes how important and proud she was. It wasn't that this is like some menial stuff. This is part of what the revolution is about. And this was my task. And just like some of those guerrillas who came in were women, the bottom line was everybody had a role. So Mugabe as a teacher, and I guess that's the central point I want to make. As Mugabe as a teacher, always tried to struggle to have us understand what education is really about and where you get genuine education from. And so when you say a revolutionary, many of you here, I don't want to talk to the choir. Many of you here, probably here in Workers' World Party, I'm sure, in terms of your solidarity with the national liberation struggles in general and Zimbabwe in particular, know many of the historical points in that. But I saw more in terms of talking about Mugabe as that person thereof, in terms of the closeness. I remember one time when we would go see him when he would come to New York sometimes, he would sit in the hotel and he would sit with Viola, our chairperson, and he would talk to her and he would always hold her hand while he's talking to her, and very penetrative. He says, so how are you doing? And he's looking almost like through you. And he would always say to us, particularly as some of his comrades passed away, I told him to take care of himself. I told him he was weighing too much. I told him to exercise. I don't know why they don't listen to me and stuff. But those kind of little quotes and little expressions and stuff, but it was him teaching, because he was saying your health is critical. If this is what you take up to do, then you must take care of yourself. And comrades must take care of each other. And there's no excuses why something happens to a comrade and everybody else don't know. And then you start whispering after the fact, oh, that was terrible. But you know what? I knew they should have stopped doing that. And I think his point to us is, no. Revolutionaries and people who take up this question of fundamental change and the battle it involves takes a toll on your health. And it's a collective responsibility to take care of each other and look after each other. And for the president, he saw so many of his comrades pass away. And that was his comment, though, that as he's tremendous revolutionary, but he didn't do that. And I struggle with him to do that, and he didn't do that. I remember years ago, I was talking about Mao used to smoke cigarettes a lot, and I was saying, that's a bad habit. And the guy looked at me and said, Mao's one of the greatest revolutionaries in the world. I said, he might be, but he don't need to smoke them damn cigarettes. Now you might be telling me he's real deep in everything, but he needs to put them cigarettes down, and they don't even have filters and stuff, But the president was certainly a teacher for us, a comrade for us. The struggle around the land, I always had a developing understanding about the move to take the land back. Because now I understand much more retrospectively that decision to take the land back always was perceived as some landless folks said, I got to go take it, and they ran on the farms and took the land back, and the president sat back and said, oh my goodness, I don't know, what am I going to do? But, you know, being a revolutionary, the party's got to support them like that. And, you know, over time I began to understand that was always the plan. The plan was to take the land back. The question was how to take it back and try to minimize the contradictions that would come up. And so one of the first ones was not to make it like it was initially a government policy, but it was a spontaneous occurrence that happened. And in that regard, it was always planned. And even when I was struggling to understand what was happening, you know, and I talked to some of the farmers, I talked to some of the people, some of the chiefs in the different towns and villages and stuff, it always came off that way until later on I got a better understanding that it was always their plan when to do it and how to do it, because they knew once they did it, it was going to set off a chain of reactions that were going to be so detrimental to the people, because Western Europe has never viewed Africa as being a legitimate owner of its own land. And the heart and soul and ideology of white supremacy comes from the justification to what you're going to do to not only a people, but whether they have any rights to where they actually came from, you know. And so the president was very understanding of that. And so he knew once they made that decision, because if you remember, before that time, he was the belle of the ball. I think that they gave him, the Queen gave him, I don't know, I forgot what they gave you in England, but they gave him they didn't give him the crown, but they gave him some honor. He was all that. But once that land, and it was no way to take it, there wasn't going to be reaction, but it was trying to minimize how it was. The people did it. And, well, we got to do what the people said. But the party did it and orchestrated how it happened. And so I thought that was a very deep thought in the real world about prices you pay and how to minimize how it's going to affect the people themselves. You can make very quick decisions. You can make uninformed decisions. As I remember Fidel said, you know, once, that your ego can't be in it. You know, we could have told the world that at Cuita Carnival that we whipped the South Africans' ass, because we did. Their tanks were flying and their planes were on the ground. He says, but when you beat somebody badly and then you go around talking stuff about it, it only makes them that much harder to defeat when you come back at them again. And I said, what a powerful lesson. And you know, revolutionaries who really have a relationship to the people understand that it's not ego. You're making decisions that can cost thousands, tens of thousands of people's lives. So they have to be well thought out, and it's not about fronting. It's about real impact. And so the decision about how to take the land was such an important, well thought out plan of how to do that and how to minimize how the West would see what the sharpest expression of that was, which was the party, and how to actually orchestrate that. So that was a lesson that, you know, we learned from the president and from party members. But I think the question of the land and the struggle, I'll talk a little bit about the sanctions, which have been almost 2 decades now. You know, in the spirit of the Cuban Revolution, it is so difficult for a developing country to withstand Western sanctions. It's a difficult question to explain to people. Sometimes it's better to explain it to them as if you had a block and you had headed a block association and then your block got cut off. You know, sometimes to really understand that it's not an H-bomb, it's not an A-bomb, but it's a 21st century H-bomb and A-bomb, because it comes at the very, what did they say during the Senate? How do you make an economy scream? And in that screaming, make the people beg for any change. You know, it's just like the school system. you run out of a house because his house is on fire, so you run out, and sometimes you run anywhere because you're in fear. And that was always the intent, and always the intent of sanctions. They're a tool. And so in Zimbabwe, these 2 decades of sanctions have had a tremendous effect. I've been there when I've been in stores where there's nothing on the shelves. I've been there when I've been in stores and everything is on the shelf. You know, the ups and downs, the currency. I remember, if you remember, not worth a continental, that expression, you may not know that. That's a little history. I don't know where they teach that anymore. But the revolutionary, the money was worth so much, they used to be carried around in wheelbarrows. And they would say it's not worth a continental. Well, in Zimbabwe, I remember once I was sitting there, I was a multimillionaire. Sarah, I had a box of money. I said, oh, shoot, this is $30 million. So I sat and, and I told my son that night on the phone. He was back home. I said, your pops is a millionaire now. I'll bring some of this cash back. But you watch the currency go to incredible. Yeah, it's incredible. But 90% of Zimbabweans are not in Harare. They're not in Bulawayo. They're in the rural areas. And one of the contradictions of sanctions in terms of impact was it impacted sharply inside those cities where once the colonialists left, all of the infrastructure that had been built to serve them. I remember going in a department store one time and you thought you were in Bloomingdale's. You went in there as a cosmetic counter and the women are putting makeup on and stuff, So after the colonialists left, places like that just deteriorated because there was no need for them. And so what happens to the workers in terms of even housing? The cities weren't built to serve people. They were built to just hold you on to serve the colonizers. And so those became tremendous questions under sanctions because in the rural areas, there was still a relationship to being able to grow food, to have access to clean water. Of course, electricity was always a difficult question, but the cities became like a hotbed of where the make the economy scream really took on a real character to it. And it also became the basis of where the opposition was born. And although the white farmers funded it and started it on some of the farm workers that left, the real impact of it was in the urban areas where there was lack of work, And so those decades, 2 decades now, coming up on 2 decades of sanctions, have had a tremendous impact on Zimbabwe. And I think it has led to I'll just talk about that in a second, but let me just get back to what I think people would be interested to hear. What happened in the end? And, of course, you all welcomed me here once before, and I know Monica came to Sister's Place when we came back from the special party conference after Mugabe stepped down, and yes, of course, was forced to step down. So what's going on? What's going on there? And, our yardstick has been what Mugabe taught us. He said, the party rules. It's the party he helped found. And the thing about when you build something that you have confidence in and you tell people they have confidence in, and the most important thing you tell them is the person is not the party. The party is the people. And so the first thing that struck us about what went down was first, that it was not violent. It was not hundreds of thousands of people dying. That's the first thing that gave us a sense of what's going on in terms of this change. The other thing was that the party, all provinces of the party, voted in favor of the new direction. And, of course, supported the Army's position that the first responsibility of the Army is to ensure the safety and tranquility of the people, and that they were suppressing what was a coup that was going on internally inside Zimbabwe. And let me just tell you, and what that coup involved was President Mugabe's wife, Grace, and not as the leader of it, but as the subject of the person who would manipulate the president. And one of the things, what's that saying? Tell no lies and tell no easy victories. Fortunately, it was not violent. But the reality is the party's transition, you always hope would be optimum. It took too long. And the president, as loving and much respect we have for him, did not make critical decisions at critical times and allowed a kind of cabal to develop using his wife and his respect for her to be manipulated by her in his very old age. The president was too old to be the president, and the transition was not as straightforward as it should have been because there was an internal struggle inside the party, and that's just what it was. And there was an attempt in the party for there to be an internal coup inside the party that was put down. And once it was put down, the party consolidated itself. The December 12th movement is not a member of ZANU-PF in that regard. And so we struggle to hear what the political line is and struggle for our historical relationship to respect for the party. And in that regard, we then, as Monica will tell you when we came back, we said, we think Zimbabwe is still on the right track. You know, they had to resolve a contradiction, as we always do, right? Even in our organizations, we struggle to do that. But fortunately, it wasn't a violent one. And fortunately, our view is that the party is continuing on the line of march. But what are the contradictions that probably fostered that? ZANU-PF was a liberation movement. It wasn't a Marxist-Leninist party. You know, that's not what it was. It didn't operate from the Marxist principles of democratic centralism, certain forms of it, but it was not a revolutionary Marxist party. Are there Marxists in it? Absolutely. But there are other forces in it. And the struggle, we thought, and we always had that view, was very early on, the struggle for ideology and the building of a party school to teach a generation of ideologically, where are you going? You know, there's only two forces out there, so you can't pretend there's a third one. So eventually you're going in some direction in that sense. And as Workers' World Party has been conscious of national liberation struggles, and when we say that, the completion of the national liberation struggles, not just the struggle for political power, but the struggle for economic power, which is part and parcel of that struggle, has to go on. And the people internally have to fight for the line of march in that sense. Unfortunately, imperialism doesn't let you make those decisions easily. And so very quickly, some of us who I believe are somewhat, I think, opportunistic or immature politically, start looking at countries as if they're looking at their own neighborhoods and not understanding the struggle that goes on to liberate yourself and to make self-determining decisions, and then to struggle internally to resolve the line of march. And so I think some of those lessons are learned. I will put together kind of a slide. I just really haven't just had time because of the GA and stuff. But one of the banners that's outside the party headquarters is in 2019, 2020, party ideology is key because they're building a party school. And they've always had some schools, but not the necessary structure to determine ideologically what is going to be the direction of Zimbabwe in that sense. And so we're confident, though, that there's some very honest people. We're confident that their struggle, like in New York against corruption, somebody did a piece the other day saying sanctions breed corruption, because when you destroy an economy, I mean, it leads to corruption. I mean, it's you know, and so we watched some of that there, and we watched some of the rectification for it. We've listened to this policy of Zimbabwe is open for business. And quite honestly, you know, this is our view. We think we kind of go overboard a little bit. We're open for business, but we also understand for them it's a tactic. That the reality is this sanction stuff is crushing on them. It is crushing on them. And right now, this October 25th piece that's going on is the first time in a long time since the days of apartheid have African countries come out and unify in an anti-imperialist statement, because SADC, which is 16 countries in Southern Africa, they took the position that the sanctions have to be lifted. That's an anti-imperialist statement by 16 countries, you know? And hopefully the momentum from that will take it to the African Union. You know, hopefully that. But right now, the fact that these 16 countries took this up is historic because they're not all in the same line. And I'm listening to some of the statements from some of the presidents, and I kind of said, why'd they even put his statement in there? But the bottom line is, I'm opposed to the sanctions. I'm opposed to the sanctions. And that struggle for unity around that is very important. Hopefully the AU, when they have their session, they will indicate that. They had said that kind of before, but right now it's much more, you got to say it out front. I don't know whether you recently know, and you'll tell me my time now, you recently know that the ambassador from the African Union to the United States was fired. This sister, and I don't want to say her name wrong, her name is Ambassador Quayo. I think it's Quayo, it's Q-A-O, Quayo. She's actually Zimbabwean. And she's a doctor. Her and her husband have been here. I'm sure she's an American citizen now, or at least her husband. They have medical facilities in Georgia. She lives in Georgia. The AU begged her, we want you to be the ambassador from the AU to the United States. They recently fired her. Her last days, my understanding, is October 31st. And we tried to get into why. And then I remember I heard a speech by her that Roland Martin, this television pro in Washington, D.C., you familiar? And yeah, I'll send you his link with it. I don't know if have you ever heard, any of you ever heard her speak? No? I'll send you the link to hear her speak on this. Now I know why they fired her. And she was making this speech, and she went through this historical thing about the balkanization of Africa and how these small countries were created so no one country could deal with Europe as a whole. That some of these, well, you know, historically Africa, some of these were nations. The boundaries were set by their national territory. They went right in and sliced that up. So, you know, you got some in this country, some in that one, you know, the Berlin Conference. So she would go back to the Berlin Conference and say, it was never designed for us to be in charge of ourselves. And then she led into the French and the French colonization in Africa. And so the new commissioner for the African Union is from Chad. And he fired her. And Jerry Rawlings, who's the former president of Ghana, I'll send you his statement. He says, this is just the deepest hypocrisy in the world. He said, when are Africans going to stand up? He says, he unilaterally fired her. And that didn't mean he couldn't. But the bottom line was, what was her offense? Her offense was to put Africa in the context of a real history and the role of Europe in that history. And I think Jerry Rawlings said, you mean even in this day, you get punished for telling the truth? You know, and when you hear her speech, I mean, it's like she's like a historian going back, but they said in particular, it was her assault on French colonialism. And it made me remember with Gbagbo in Cote d'Ivoire, that one of the reasons the French came in and actually invaded and took him outside of the palace was because Gbagbo was going to take the Couvarian dollar and stop it from being pegged against the French franc. And see, that will get you killed. You know, that's what got Gaddafi killed, talking about a African bank based on gold as opposed to the economy of the West. That's what got him killed. And that idea of that and her harping on the French in particular, because if there's any European country that depends on the neo-colonial relationships to Africa, it is France. If France lost its former colonies, it would crumble in terms of its economy, and that's what she harped on, and he's from Chad. So you know, somebody said to me, well, is there something that can be done? I said, I don't need the African Union would have to do it. You know, they would have to say something. But this is the kind of stuff going on. So what I'm saying, will the AU take a position against sanctions? Well, it's the first thing what SADC did. You know, you start with what you got, and then you work for where you got to go in that sense. So, you know, I really wanted to have, I hope I haven't talked too long, because I really wanted to maybe answer. Yeah. No, I didn't. No, I didn't, because sometimes I'm trying to frame something with, and I know I'm talking to my comrades who have so much information already, but I also wanted to answer any questions that people might have, So maybe I'll stop, and maybe some young questions, maybe some like old questions, but maybe some questions to answer. I mean, the only other thing I would say is October 25th is a day that they declared is a day of action against sanctions. And so all of the countries in SADC are supposed to be taking up some kind of action about the sanctions. But also October 25th is supposed to be the kickoff for the campaign that the end result is to lift the sanctions. So it's not only a day, an event, but it's also the launching of a campaign in SADC about the sanctions. And it's so important for African countries to stick together to make a decision. The sanctions are not only affecting Zimbabwe, they're affecting the whole region. And I was going to talk about, but Zimbabwe sits like in a center. So its rail system is a system that goods and services pass through it. Goods coming into Mozambique come through Zimbabwe to the other side. So all of these systems you think about, their transportation system, their rail system, their healthcare system. We were talking with some brothers who wanted to see about how they could deal with the water question. So they wanted to see about bottled water in terms of water issues there. I said, no, the water issues there are system issues. The water system in Harare. And what are the issues? The chemicals that keep the water pure. That's the sanctions. That's when it hits you. X-ray machines, medicines to defeat diseases that have been defeated decades ago. No access to that. And one of the most people who do business and have some maybe small business, if you have a business, you do not pay when you get the goods. You get 30 days, 60 days to pay. When they tell you have to pay right at the spot, then it drains your reserves immediately. And then you run into people who take advantage of the fact you have to pay in cash, and you pay more for it. So all of those things have really attacked the country in terms of that. Zimbabwe issue is not so much, people are saying, well, do you need this one or that one? No, it's their finances. It's literally their finances. They've tried to attack the currency, and we were just there for President Mugabe's funeral. They've now taken the dollar out of the system, so they don't use the American dollar anymore. So they used it creatively at a time, and then they didn't announce it. They just said, today, no more use of the dollar. And then they're trying to go towards more digital currency. If you go for an actual cash transaction, it's American dollar for 8 Zim dollars. But if you do it digitally, it's 15 Zim dollars for an American dollar. But you cannot transact business in American dollars anymore. So that was a tremendous, it hit me. We're in the store, and it's like, we're sitting there with dollars in our pocket that we should have changed at the airport. And I'm saying, wow, but no credit cards? Yes. But no exchange of dollars. And there's a black market there. We're going to some place and women in the street with the cash taking like that. But they're trying to move away from that because you can't have an economy with somebody else's currency. Ultimately, you can. As a tactic, yes, but as a strategy, you cannot do that because you don't control the value of that. So all these struggles are going on. And like I said, let me answer any question that you have. On the question of China, first, the President Mugabe and the party came with the Look East policy in Zimbabwe. And that was very important because prior to that, the former colonies in Africa still had to look to their former colonizer in terms of capital investments, industry, and stuff like that. And remember, South Africa's political independence is rather new. And it's the most industrialized place in Africa. But two things. One, that the Look East policy is what really got Zimbabwe over the hump to this point in terms of that. On the other hand, and so that's just a fact, that's just a concrete fact. On the other hand, people have had concerns about China's role in Africa because China has made major billions and billions of dollars of investments in Africa. And so in the black community, one of the things that comes up is, before comes up some places. Oh, before it was white people and Europeans exploiting Africa, now here come the Chinese. And you know, we always try to take a very political view, and one, just facts. The Chinese didn't have any colonies in Africa. That's number one. So the fundamental starting point, they didn't have colonies in Africa, and they don't have armies in Africa to ensure there being colonies in Africa. So that's number one. Number two, it's people's responsibility in terms of being self-determining. This just came up in a meeting the other night. Someone raised, who was talking about doing some investments in Zimbabwe, you know, to get paid out of sanctions. They said, yeah, you got to watch out for the Chinese. I said, you have to watch out for anything that undermines your fight for self-determination and putting the wealth of the people back into people's hands. So that's the starting point. And don't play people cheap that they don't see something you see, you know? And oftentimes that happens, particularly in Africa. People play people cheap, like people that if something's bad going on, they don't see it. It requires you over here in the United States to look and say, oh, there it is, like that. We said that's nonsense. Bottom line is, there are places in China where the Chinese have carried out worker relation policies, have imported many Chinese workers to Africa to do work. Some of that has been joint learning. Some of it has been taking some of their unemployed there and employing them overseas. There have been issues where there have been indications of racism on some of the Chinese part in Ghana. I know there were some efforts or issues around that. And we always say this, there are no perfect people, there are no perfect countries, there are no perfect parties. It is the responsibility of wherever you are to struggle for equality, just exchange and trade. And in that regard, the attacks on China around that, to me, ring hollow in that sense, because it's kind of a paternalism that it underlines it. You know, oh, these sneaky Chinese are coming in. There's a professor in Kenya, I believe his name, Professor Lumumba, and he's on a tirade, particularly among young Africans in Southern Africa, that the most dangerous thing in Africa is the Chinese. And the policy, and that they had actually subjugated the Kenyan government with these loans and tying them up with these loans and stuff. And I haven't done enough research on it, but if I listen to what he's saying, he never produces the facts to augment what he's saying. You know, give me one of the policies and let me see what it is, and give me one of the contracts and let's see what it is. So the only thing I would say about China right now, China has played an extremely progressive and supportive role to giving African former colonies of Europe an alternative in terms of development. And I think those relationships will get measured by the transfer of technology, the transfer of skills, and the nature of the relationships in terms of the economy that lets African countries develop as if the relationship is one of mutual, when we say proletarian internationalism, you know. So that's that on that. Also something to say to folks that didn't get raised, but I think it's important to get raised, there's a group called ADOS. Some people might have heard of it, ADOS. This is a motion inside our community. It really seemed like it started around the question of reparations. But what it is an anti-Pan-African movement of some folks who have some very shady relationships to some very right-wing organizations, and my view is funding-wise. But the position is that folks from Africa and the Caribbean are the central problems that black people have in their community, that in terms of reparations, that we're the ones who were affected, and Africans and Caribbeans, they're the ones bringing drugs into our neighborhood, they're the ones that are most detrimental in our neighborhood, and da-da-da. It's a very reactionary line that's being pushed by them. Many brothers and sisters, certainly Pan-Africanists, have taken positions around it, but it's a trend out there. So you probably might hear it or come and experience it. It's called ADOS, you know. That's that. The other thing, there was a question that was raised about the AU. No, but before the AU was, no, I'm trying to think, what did the sister, I know yours was A, but I'm trying, oh, why should, and then I'll go into the AU thing. My understanding was there was no excuse. That, in fact, it's not been a public announcement, at least as gets filtered out. It's not like the AU issued a formal statement that she's gone. It kind of started from Ilumbe's son sent me a note saying, did you hear anything about the AU ambassador to the United States getting fired? I'm getting this kind of on the, network that happened. I said, I didn't hear anything. I saw something that said she did, but still wasn't confirming it. And then I saw the position from Jerry Rollins, and it said, oh, no. And so that shows you the insidious nature of it. I haven't seen anything official from the AU that says that. But it is happening as of my understanding, October 31st. November 1st, she won't be here in terms of that. So that's that. In terms of the AU, it was in question of... If there are any more revolutionary alternatives to the AU groups? But let me... The motion in our experience, and I'll just take back, when we were there for Comrade Shemarenga's funeral, we were talking to the former foreign minister, Mbegwe, in Zimbabwe, and he was letting us know that a few years ago, and it just happened this past August, the liberation movements in Southern Africa, that's SWAPO in Namibia, ANC in South Africa, Frelimo, and ZANU-PF, have continued to meet on the question, and these are party meetings, on the question of the struggle to liberate and finish the revolution in Southern Africa. So it's not a government-to-government relationship. It's a party-to-party relationship on the questions of fulfilling Nkrumah and Lumumba's their thing that you first free the political world, but if you don't free the economic one, then the political one will fall. And so we went to one a number of years ago. We wanted to go to that meeting, and they were saying, well, no, you can't really come to this meeting. But they're meeting on this question. And ideologically, I think one of the things that's going on is this struggle for what's going to be the political line. Countries that are devastated, and I'm going to tell you, after the liberation struggles won their independence, at least politically, most of those parties were saturated with young brothers and sisters who were socialists. I mean, they were. The Soviet Union played such a role. The Chinese played such a role in armed struggle in terms of supplying weapons and stuff. And they also ideological. And a lot of these young people grew up, they were influenced by socialist ideas, which I want to come back to that, just socialist ideas. But if you remember, there was a time, it wasn't Mozambique, it was the People's Republic of Mozambique. It was the People's Republic of Angola. And one of the things that happened with the fall of the Soviet Union, which was devastating to the international community, was it allowed the West to focus on this question of the economic question. And then you develop this thing around you couldn't get loans from the World Bank or the IMF unless you had multi-parties. Democracy was tied to multi-parties. And see, fortunately for Cuba, in terms of their party, but also in terms of a critical time in the relationship to the Soviet Union, the Cubans were able to develop and solidify their party and its relationship to the people, and certainly the Soviet Union's handling the deficit in the economy there to be able to sustain Cuba to, in terms of, it became like a wall, in that sense, and very self-reliant and very skilled in certain things that they could trade internationally, particularly in terms of medicines and stuff like that. So there is motion there, in Zimbabwe. You know, we talked to some of the young folks there, but I was much more hardened by seeing, you know, much more encouraged by seeing the party's position that we have to build ideological clarity. Now, you know, that to me, that was a very positive statement, because they're making it at the same time that they're under these sanctions. And I'm telling you, sanctions are so, I think as Sarah said, sanctions are so, I was just reading Cuba, they said they're only getting 60% of the energy needs they have in terms of fuel in Cuba. And Trump and them are punishing companies that deal with Cuba. That's the other side of sanctions. Not only the sanctions against the economy, but punishing people who violate the sanctions. Meaning if there was some bank that did some transactions of some checks in Venezuela, and they fined them $2.5 million for processing some checks for them. You know, so that's the nature of the thing. So